Hello fellow kids, and welcome back to What is Politics? Last time, we took a look at a frequently asked question. Why are communist countries always dictatorships? Is it because communism is inherently flawed and it just inevitably has to lead to dictatorship? Is communism just incompatible with human nature? Is it because all of the communist countries just didn't do communism right? And we saw that the reason that communist countries have all been dictatorships is actually really boring and simple. They've all been dictatorships because they chose to be dictatorships on purpose. They all based themselves on the Soviet Union's Marxist-Leninist model. And the Soviet Union, which was based in Russia, was the first time that a group of communists took power and held it for longer than a few months. And all those countries chose to emulate that model because while it failed at delivering the freedom and worker control of industry that were the main promises of socialism, it did succeed in other important ways. And remember that the words socialism and communism were more or less synonymous until the Russian Revolution. So while the Soviet Union and its Marxist-Leninist model failed at socialism, it succeeded at industrializing a formerly poor peasant country and making it a world superpower. It succeeded in educating what had been a largely illiterate population, and in providing them with services, material security, and with a second-world middle-income country standard of living. It also succeeded in allowing the Soviet Union to maintain its national independence from rich countries, and even though workers in the Soviet Union couldn't choose or elect the top leadership of the country, the doors were open for workers and peasants to rise through the party and government bureaucracies, and to gain access to middle-class positions and even the topmost elite positions of power in that country. These were very important and impressive achievements to the people in the poor countries who carried out all of the successful communist revolutions around the world. And the only communist countries that weren't originally poor countries were some of the Eastern Bloc countries like East Germany and Czechoslovakia, where the governments were basically installed by the Soviet Union after World War II, even though those parties had some popular base of support. But that brings us back to a modified version of our original question. Why did the Soviet Union fail at communism and become a dictatorship in the first place? The people who established the Soviet Union did not set out to create an authoritarian dictatorship. Their goal was to establish a socialist society, which was supposed to end all forms of domination relationships between human beings. First and foremost, socialists wanted to get rid of the employer-employee relationship, where unlimited property rights give owners the dictatorial power to order around workers all day long, because the workers depend on the owner's property to live. So socialism aimed to replace the dictatorship of the owner with the democracy of the workers, with workers directly managing their own workplaces. And socialism was also supposed to eliminate the undemocratic rule of the government by the wealthy, whether it's the wealthy aristocracy who rule via the monarchical state, or whether it's the wealthy business class who dominate elected governments because their wealth lets them pay for campaign contributions and armies of lobbyists and control over the media. They wanted to replace this with worker control over the government. And for many socialists, including the people who founded the Soviet Union, worker control of government meant the immediate or eventual elimination of the state itself. Because a state was seen as a machine that allows a minority of people to dominate the majority of people. And as we saw last time, basically Marx thought that that was the state's only purpose. But instead of eliminating wage labor, the Soviet Union just turned all the workers into employees of the state, subject to the dictatorship of the party-appointed factory manager instead of the dictatorship of the private owner. And instead of abolishing the state, the Soviet Union built up an all-powerful state that controlled the workers instead of the other way around. Why did this happen? That's the question that we're going to be answering today and in the next episode. Today, we're going to set the scene for the two Russian revolutions of February and October of 1917, which ultimately resulted in the establishment of the Soviet Union. So we'll be looking at competing socialist ideas of the various people who became key players in those two revolutions. Their theories, their strategies, their ideologies, and their practical realities, their class backgrounds and material interests. And at the same time, we'll be putting these competing ideas into context by looking at the practical, material, and social conditions of Russia at the time. In particular, by looking at the conditions and social structure of the peasants, who comprised the overwhelming majority of the population at the time. And then, in the next episode, we'll look at what happened when the rubber hits the road, and the various socialist theories and ideas smash head-on into the reality of the actual conditions of Russia, and how all of that eventually comes together and results in the Marxist-Leninist one-party authoritarian system that characterizes all of the longer-lasting communist states of the 20th and 21st centuries. Okay, let's get to it, and let the cartoon begin. So, last time where we left off, we saw that Karl Marx and his followers, including Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and all the other eventual leaders of the Russian Revolution, they all thought that socialism was not possible in poor countries with majority peasant populations, like Russia. According to Karl Marx and his writing partner Freddie Engels, you could only have socialism in rich countries where capitalism was highly advanced, like in England and Germany. And the reasons were, first of all, because you needed capitalism to develop the advanced technologies and big factories and mass production that you needed for Marx's vision of high-tech socialism to be economically viable. And at the same time, capitalism takes a population made up largely of peasants or independent farmers and then puts them out of business and pushes them into the cities to become a giant mass of physically concentrated workers who don't own any property and who can barely make a living on the job market in very difficult conditions. And it's these workers, which Marx called the proletariat, meaning people who own only their children. It's the proletariat who will make socialism politically viable once they become a significant enough majority of the population. But in poor countries, like in Russia in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you didn't have the technology necessary to make socialism economically viable, nor did you have the concentrated proletariat necessary to make socialism politically viable. What you did have was a country made up of 85% peasants, with the rest being aristocratic landlords or bureaucrats and a few middle-class professionals, plus a teeny-tiny proletariat. And according to Marx, the peasants were just too ignorant and isolated to be capable of intelligent political action. They were unable to imagine politics on a scale beyond their little isolated villages, and as property owners, they would be expected to think like little capitalist business owners. They'd want to protect private property against attempts to own and manage it communally. And we saw that Marx and Engels and their followers, like Georgy Plekhanov, the first prominent Russian Marxist, they believed that if socialists somehow did manage to seize and retain power in a poor country like Russia, that they'd end up creating an authoritarian dictatorship, with an urban socialist minority ruling over a giant rural peasant majority against their will and against their interests, totally defeating the whole purpose of socialism, which is supposed to be the free association of the producers, in Marx's words. So we left off with two big questions. If Marx and his followers thought that you couldn't have a successful socialist revolution in a poor country like Russia, then why would a bunch of Marxists carry out a socialist revolution there? And why would they try to start a socialist party there in the first place? To answer these questions, we need to understand the history of the socialist and Marxist movements in Russia. In Europe in the 19th century, socialism had the support of millions of industrial workers and artisans, as well as among intellectuals. And it was the workers' movement which in many ways was the heart of the socialist movement in Europe. But in Russia at the time, you barely had any working class, in the sense of the proletariat. And meanwhile, the vast peasant majority of the country tended to be illiterate and isolated from the intellectual trends of Europe and of Russia itself. So when socialism comes to Russia in the middle of the 1800s, it's almost exclusively popular among intellectuals. And these intellectuals were the urban middle class, but also the rural middle class, and there were also many aristocratic socialist intellectuals. And the line between upper middle class and aristocracy was pretty blurry in this period, as many aristocrats were middle class and even impoverished in terms of their economic wealth. And you could gain aristocratic status by getting certain middle-class and upper-middle-class jobs. For example, Lenin, who was the leader of the October Revolution and the founder of the Soviet Union, his father became a hereditary aristocrat by becoming a director of schools in his district. And we see that some of the most important socialist thinkers in Russia, Plekhanov, the father of Russian Marxism, Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union, and Bakunin and Kropotkin, the leading anarchists, and many others came from aristocratic families of one sort or another. And these intellectuals, despite coming from more fortunate classes, were interested in socialism because they were frustrated by the lack of freedoms and civil liberties in Russia under the extremely heavy-handed and oppressive monarchy. And they were also motivated by wanting to be a cultural part of Europe, which they were cut off from in various ways, both economically but also due to government censorship. And the middle-class intellectuals in particular were frustrated by their inability to find advancement in the Tsarist bureaucracy. And the Tsar, of course, was the name for the Russian monarch, and the word Tsar comes from the Latin Caesar, just like the word Kaiser in German. And given how oppressive the Tsarist regime was, the feeling of hatred against the regime was really intense and widespread among all classes. And among young people from these middle-class and aristocratic families, there was of course a sense of idealism, but also a lot of guilt, especially from the aristocratic class, because these were kids reading European socialist literature about the exploitation of the working class and of the peasants, while their own families were the ones directly doing the exploiting. Plekhanov's family, for example, and like I said, Plekhanov was the first important Russian Marxist, his family literally owned serfs. And you'll notice that you have a lot of the same dynamics today in the United States. You have really expensive Ivy League schools, where many of the socialists and various supposedly radical types that you'll find there are actually rich kids and trust fund children, like everyone else in those schools, and they spend their college years reading about how horrible capitalism is, while their parents are all CEOs and corporate lawyers, and while they themselves are often in training to go work for those big corporations as lawyers or accountants or software developers or whatever it may be. Orlando Figes, author of the very long but very readable book, The People's Tragedy, tells us that, quote, "Guilt was the psychological inspiration of the revolution. Nearly all of these radical intellectuals were acutely conscious of their wealth and privilege. As children of noblemen brought up by serf domestics on the estate, many of them felt a special personal sense of guilt, since these little masters had usually been allowed to treat their serf nannies and, quote, uncles, whose job it had been to play with them, with cruel contempt." Unquote. And if you know any rich people today, you'll notice that a lot of their parents encourage their kids to treat their Filipina or Latina nannies who raise them like shit. Because the nannies are the ones who are raising their kids for them, and the parents don't want the kids to love the nanny more than the parents. And they're also training their kids to be little employers and landlords and CEOs. And you tend to be better at those jobs if you don't have a lot of empathy getting in the way, and if you can see your tenants and employees as being less deserving of wealth than you are. And Orlando Figes goes on in that section of the book to point out that 19th century Russian literature was, quote, "dominated by the theme of repentance for privilege," unquote. And he gives examples from Tolstoy and other important novels. Which rich college kid political trends from today does being obsessed with the sin of privilege remind you of? And Figes was writing in the 1990s, so he wasn't trying to make the connection with modern privilege discourse that's been popular over the last 10 years. But of course, just because you're a trust fund kid, or a literal prince, like the great anarchist thinker Pyotr Kropotkin was, that doesn't mean that you can't be a sincere socialist. And today, we do have some decent trust fund socialist kids coming from elite colleges who are doing important organizing work or writing for socialist magazines. But coming from these rich kid backgrounds very often creates various issues, even among the most sincere revolutionaries, in terms of what socialism actually means to them and why they want it. But we'll look a little more at that in a bit. So, in this period, the 1860s to 1905 basically, you have a very small but growing proletariat, meaning industrial workers, factory workers, who, as we'll see later, are angry at their working and living conditions. And then you have very angry and frustrated middle and aristocratic classes, who are overrun with guilt at the same time, and they're also very angry at the regime for denying them their civil liberties. And then you have the overwhelming mass of the population, who were peasants, and were barely aware of any of the political currents of the day. And they're mostly focused on their own immediate exploitation, and their increasingly desperate and deteriorating conditions, which we'll get back to in a bit. The middle-class people in Russia at the time tended to be employed or dependent in some way on the Tsarist bureaucracy, either as actual bureaucrats or else as the professionals who served them, like lawyers, doctors, teachers, and merchants. And you find these people in urban areas, but also many of them in rural areas, in administrative towns. And while you had different socialist trends and ideas among these socialist intellectuals, the most important one at the time were the Narodnik socialists, meaning populist agrarian socialists. Narod means the people, and the people in Russia were mostly peasants. And the term populist is a little misleading here, because populism usually refers to a left-wing anti-elite sentiment coming from lower classes, basically people with less power coming together to defend their interests against people with more wealth and power, like in the US in the 19th century, which is where the word populism originally comes from. And in the 19th century US, the populists were usually farmers and working class people who were rising up against economic and governmental elites. But in Russia, the populists were middle class and aristocratic people championing the cause of peasants who barely knew that their champions or their ideas even existed. Now the populists had a mishmash of ideas, But what they had in common was that they believed in a socialism based in liberty and representative democracy. And they shared an idealization of the peasants and peasant culture as the embodiment of the true ideals of Russia, but also as the material foundation for the future of socialism in Russia. In complete contrast to Marx and Engels' writings in that period, the Narodniks, the Populists, very much believed that because of its peasant character, and especially the communistic nature of Russia's peasantry, which we'll talk about in a minute, that it's exactly that peasant nature of Russia which will propel Russia into socialism. And in their view, Russia would follow a very different path to development and to socialism than Europe had and would. Specifically, Russia would not have to go through the brutal capitalist industrialization phase that Europe had been undergoing for the past century, and that Marx and Engels and their followers insisted was essential to the foundation of socialism. Now, something very striking in this period is that even though Russia was overwhelmingly made up of peasants, and the core of the Narodnik agrarian populist ideology was based on the social structure and values of the Russian peasant, the Narodnik intellectuals didn't actually know very much about the peasants. Even though a lot of the Narodniks were rural intellectuals who lived geographically much closer to the peasants, they lived in rural administrative towns where they only socialized with other rural middle-class and wealthier people. The peasants didn't live in those towns, and the interactions that these middle-class intellectuals had with the peasants tended to be brief and superficial and on unequal terms. So they might be buying things from the peasants in markets, or interacting with the peasants as their clients, like when a peasant goes to see a doctor or has to register something at a bureaucratic office, or else extremely hierarchical class relationships with peasants as nannies and servants. The exception to this were some rural teachers who taught peasants, and they tended to have more of an in-depth relationship with their students and also their families. And so the ideas that the Narodnik populist intellectuals had about the peasant majority was often a bunch of stereotypes and fantasies that urban people have about peasants or indigenous people. And while many middle-class and rich people had negative stereotypes of peasants, as stupid, violent, drunken ignoramuses, these were populist socialist intellectuals, so their heads were full of positive stereotypes, or what I like to call liberal, unicorn, zoo animal fetish object stereotypes, which are positive, but they're also infantilizing and dehumanizing at the same time. Like you're treating people like they're magical fairy tale creatures. And you're thinking of them that way because you actually see them as a means to an end that benefits you. And of course, we see a lot of this today in our era of infantile rich kid identity politics. Like I have a friend who's a black musician, and she's always been interested in political causes. But she hasn't been involved that much in local activist community because when she would get invited to participate or speak at events, she would always be grossed out because the activist kids were treating her with this creepy, worshipful reverence for being a real live black person. Like, ooh, the wholly oppressed, BIPOC, let us defer all our opinions and judgments to you with our shameful privileges, unless you have opinions that diverge from our Bible of correct stereotype opinions that you're supposed to adhere to. So she never went back to that shit, and now she just does political music projects of her own design and direction. Anyhow, in 19th century Russia, the Narodniks imagined the peasants as hard-working, honest, noble, simple, inherently good and wise folk, who embodied the spirit of true Russia. And as we'll see in a bit, this kind of fetish object worship can easily flip on a dime into actual hate and old-fashioned racism, when the objects of your worship don't fulfill the fantasy role that you set out for them. And it's not super surprising if you understand that those positive dehumanizing stereotypes fulfill the same function as racist negative stereotypes. Because the ultimate object of both of these kind of stereotypes is to enhance your own power. And in this case, the peasants were seen as the ticket to socialism for the intellectual classes. And the populists had very good reason to believe that the peasants would help usher in the era of socialism in Russia. Most importantly, in Russia, unlike in most of Western Europe, the peasant wasn't the petit bourgeois, mom-and-pop capitalist landowner described in Marx's 18th Brumaire or his Capital. Most of the peasants of Russia were already real, actual communists living on communes. They regularly redistributed their plots of land equally. They shared various resources and did communal enterprises together. And they made communal decisions via patriarchal direct democracy in their communal assemblies. And this was the stuff that the intellectuals did know about the peasants. So, according to the Narodnik populists, if you had some peasant literacy and communications technology to connect the peasants to the urban culture, and the urban intellectuals, and you had some improved agricultural techniques, you could build a socialist society of peasant communes, connected together by a democratic state, staffed by the intellectual class, of course. And so, given that the peasants were already communists, and that they were horribly exploited by the existing system, the Narodniks socialists, the populist socialists, believed that all the peasants needed was to be taught about socialism by the middle class and aristocratic socialist kids, and then they would surely rise up in revolt and conveniently do all the dangerous work of overthrowing the monarchy by force. After which, the middle class and aristocratic intellectuals would get to occupy most of the top positions in the new socialist government. And always do a little thought exercise in your mind when you're assessing radical intellectuals. Ask yourself, where does this person see themselves in their ideal society that they're advocating for? Are they just going to be one of the regular people, or will they be in some special position of power? Very often, it's the second type of person. And people who come from social backgrounds where your wealth is based on using other people for your own benefit, like business owners and aristocrats and people who hire nannies to raise kids for them and treat them like shit. These people often tend to think of other people, particularly less wealthy people, and the people, in a very instrumental way, as tools for enhancing their own power and status, because that's what they do for a living. They use other people to enhance their power and status. Anyhow, in order to make their vision of a peasant intellectual alliance towards socialism a reality, a movement developed among the populist socialists, particularly among the college kids, called the Going to the People movement, where the socialist kids would go out into rural peasant areas and try to convert the peasants to socialism. And they would also try to get them to rebel against the Tsarist monarchy. And this peaked during the summer school break of 1874, when thousands of college kids went to the people to preach gospels of socialism and to atone for their privileges and pay their dues by going to get jobs as farmhands and learning what the peasant lifestyle was all about. Now, going out and making contact with the vast majority of the population is exactly what you need to do if you want to change the society in a positive way. And it's really amazing to me how almost no one is doing this today. And as we'll see, there was every reason for the peasants to be very, very interested in socialism. So these Narodnik kids were 100% on the right track. However, like we just talked about, these kids knew very little about the peasants aside from their fantasy stereotypes and what they were reading in their popular novels. And as a result, many of them approached their going to the people task like a bunch of self-absorbed, idiotic rich kids. They would try to dress like peasants and talk and act like peasants. And part of it was just thinking that this would make the peasants somehow like them more, but part of it was also because pretending to be a peasant was cool, like when rich suburban kids today want to be poor black ghetto rappers without any of the poverty. So, imagine the equivalent today. Like some Harvard or Yale students whose parents make like $500,000 a year or $1 million a year, and they go out into the poor black and Latino areas surrounding their school. Because a lot of those Ivy League schools are right in the middle of poor neighborhoods. And they're like, hello, fellow N-words and Latinx. My rap name is MC Scroach, and my pronouns is they, them. But I also accept he, him pronouns and she, her pronouns. And as a fellow marginalized identity, I understand how hard it is to be black and oppressed. I make mixtape trap raps about it in my dad's $2 million studio from the record company that he owns, Sony Records. But I hate him because he's wiggity whack. YT, would you like some Xanax that I stole from my mom's pharmaceutical corporation that she's the CEO of? F capitalism, yo. So what do you say? You want to overthrow the government for me so I can become Secretary of Anti-Racism? Unsurprisingly, the peasants were not particularly impressed with this. Aside from the foolishness of many of these kids, the peasants had very good reason to be suspicious of them, no matter how they presented themselves. In general, most people from outside of their villages that the peasants would deal with were bureaucrats, landlords, moneylenders, people who were trying to exploit them or get something out of them in various ways. So they were suspicious of these outsider kids from the get-go, even when they weren't total cosplay clowns. And so, the Going to the People movement did not result in the immediate revolution and overthrow of the monarchy that many of the kids had thought would be imminent. One Going to the People student remarked that, quote, "Socialism bounced off the peasants like peas from a wall. They listened to our people as they do to the priest, respectfully, but without the slightest effect on their thinking or their actions. We cannot change the thinking of even 1 in 600 peasants, let alone 1 in 60. Unquote. And that kid that I just quoted, named Sergei Stepniak, gave up on the peasants entirely at this point and became a terrorist, like many of his peers did at this time. And a few years later, he actually managed to assassinate the head of the secret police. But some of these populist missionaries, usually young women who actually had some prior relationship with the peasants, or who just had a better idea of how to genuinely connect with human beings, they actually did have some real success in reaching them and gaining the peasants' trust and friendship. These more successful efforts involved helping peasants get the information and skills that they actually wanted, versus trying to shove ideas down their throats. And this involved helping to teach them how to read, which the peasants were very interested in. These kids organized mobile libraries, which the peasants voraciously gobbled up once they learned how to read, despite their reputations for being ignorant and stupid. Though, to the disappointment of the Narodnik kids, the peasants were a lot more interested in fictional novels and in reading about the French Revolution than in reading about socialism and the future socialist revolution. Those efforts bore fruit over time. Over the subsequent 20 years or so, the areas where the Narodnik kids had been the most active ended up being the areas where peasants later organized strikes and formed peasants' associations and populist groups in reaction to government and landlord oppression. And the Going to the People movement also coincided with a massive enrollment of peasants into rural schools, which the peasants had to scrape together their meager commune funds to collectively pay for. And we can only imagine what kind of amazing results this could have had over time had the kids learned from the more successful efforts and tried to build on them. But trying to instigate the immediate overthrow of the monarchy was obviously illegal, and most of the young radicals ended up being rounded up by the police and often punished harshly, even executed. The ones that managed to persist and avoid the police were usually the ones who the peasants came to trust, and they survived in large part because the peasants would hide them and protect them from the police. But these successful efforts were the exceptions. On the whole, given the risks involved and how badly humiliated many of the kids were, most of the kids just gave up on this strategy, and the whole Going to the People movement was nipped in the bud. So, by the late 1870s, you end up with two major reactions to the defeat of the Going to the People movement. And these reactions end up forming the main strains of Russian socialism from that point on. On the one hand, you had a majority who continued to believe that the foundation for Russian socialism was going to be the Russian peasants and their communes. The lesson that these people learned from the failure of the Going to the People movement was that the peasants were just too oppressed to revolt on their own. So you had to overthrow the monarchy and liberate the peasants first, and then you could go ahead and establish a democratic republic and connect that with the peasant communes. And it was the intellectuals who were going to have to do this, instead of the peasants doing it for them. And many of these populist intellectuals turned to terrorism and other violent anti-government activity with that goal in mind. And they weren't the only ones doing terrorism. With no legal avenues to express themselves or to organize, terrorism was an extremely popular choice. More than 17,000 people were killed by terrorism in the last 20 years of the monarchy before the socialist revolutions. Even the Tsar got murked in 1881. And it wasn't just populist, it was anarchists and blanquists and nihilists and all sorts of other frustrated intellectuals. And while there were some high-level assassinations, most of it just resulted in worse and worse government repression. Like Tsar Alexander II gets assassinated, and literally the same day his much more right-wing conservative son Alexander III takes power and ramps up the repression and reverses his dad's liberal reforms. The populist branch of socialism that wants a revolution to establish a socialist democratic republic based on peasant socialism becomes the Socialist Revolutionary Party, or the SRs. And not all of your SRs, socialist revolutionaries, were in favor of terrorism, but they all agreed that you needed a revolution to overthrow the monarchy and replace it with a democratic republic before you could move on to peasant-based socialism. Now, another group of socialists, particularly those Going to the People kids who got the most viciously rejected by the peasants, they learned a different lesson from the failure of their movement. And when rich kids and adults don't get their way, they often get really upset and have a big tantrum. So these former kids are now little adults, and they decided that the reason that they failed so badly was not because they were just inexperienced kids who didn't know what they were doing yet, or because they didn't put in the time and effort to get it right in difficult conditions. No, the reason that they failed was because the peasants were just too damn stupid and ignorant to know what's good for them. Because the peasants didn't fulfill the role that they had laid out for them in their fantasies, they switched on a dime from their liberal zoo unicorn positive stereotypes to the old-fashioned racist-style stereotypes. And they decided that peasants were a useless class that had no role in the socialist future, and that they were in fact a complete obstacle to that wonderful socialist future. And these angry, rejected Narodnik kids found a perfect affirmation of their hatred of the peasants in the works of, you guessed it, Big Daddy Papa Smurf himself, Karl Marx and Freddie Engels. Not only did Marx and Engels' writings portray peasants as stupid obstacles to socialism, but they were also inspired by Marx and Engels' confident belief that the peasants' backwards and idiotic way of life was doomed to be swept away from history by the progressive forces of advanced capitalism. And they loved the idea that the disappearance of the peasant class was the only path forward towards socialism. And just like when Hillary Clinton's people blamed her election loss on the Russians and James Comey and racist, unemployed, pill-addicted Rust Belt workers whose lives Bill Clinton had destroyed with NAFTA, instead of blaming the Clintons and 40 years of Democrats and Republicans looting and pillaging all the gains that the American working classes had made since the New Deal, the Narodnik kids found in Marxism the perfect excuse to avoid having to look in the mirror for the source of their failure to connect with the peasants. And thus, the first generation of Russian Marxists was born, and they were led by Georgy Plekhanov, whose parents had owned serfs, and who was an OG disillusioned going-to-the-people reject extraordinaire, and he hated the peasants with a passion for the rest of his life. Although socialist activity was illegal in Russia, and texts promoting socialist activity were supposed to be censored, government censors considered Marx and Engels' work to be, quote, harmless abstract speculation, and as a result, most of Marx and Engels' work were allowed to be published freely in Russia and distributed. Marxism was kind of the postmodernism of its day. It was seen as non-threatening radicalism, and the authorities at first were quite comfortable with it versus the rabble-rousing populist socialism of the Narodniks, which they feared. And that might sound crazy given how radical Marx and Engels were, but you'll see what I mean in a few seconds. Very quickly, Marx and Engels' writing had a huge impact on the Russian intelligentsia, but not in ways that you might expect. Among the intellectuals who first became enamored with Marx, particularly after Capital Volume 1 was translated into Russian, it wasn't just the peasant-hating going-to-the-people rejects, but also the big pro-capitalist economists and the big wealthy industrialists. If you know Marx's writings, you know that Marx criticizes capitalism and wants it to end, but he also portrays it as a progressive force, until it's not. The capitalist methods are brutal and exploitative, but they generate innovations and major improvements in production of goods and agricultural techniques, and the business class, which orchestrates these, tends to favor civil liberties, which benefit everyone. Meanwhile, according to Marx, the economics of capitalism tear apart backwards social superstitions and conventions and old cultural hierarchies, and they force unproductive peasants to become productive proletarians or productive large-scale agricultural entrepreneurs. And of course, according to Marx's writings at the time, you can't get to socialism without going through capitalism first. So in Russia, which was still basically governed by a monarch with a quasi-feudal land-owning aristocracy, where capitalism was just getting started, the capitalists and liberal intellectuals were waving around Das Kapital, Marx and Engels' works, to show how progressive they were, and why you needed to let the business class pay low wages, and why you needed to resist the growing call for restrictions on factory labor hours and child labor, and the calls for safer working conditions and 8-hour days, etc. Whether you're a communist or a liberal, you'll never get those liberal values that the upper classes long for, nor will you get to socialism unless we have our phase of ruthless exploitative capitalism and its horrible labor practices. To quote Esther Kingston Mann from her book Lenin and the Problem of Peasant Socialism, quote, among academic economists and industrialists, there were those who found in Marx's Capital a source of powerful arguments for the brutally aggressive virtues of free enterprise and long working hours. Moscow factory owners sponsored lectures on the Marxist proof that unfettered capitalist initiative represented a step forward in Russia's historical development. Unquote. And of course, Marx and Engels' work was also extremely critical of capitalism. So their work was also popular among the populist socialists that we've been talking about. For example, in 1870, when a Russian factory owner claimed that restrictions on child labor delayed the civilizational advances of capitalism, and that these would eventually benefit the factory workers, a populist Narodnik socialist refuted his arguments by using the descriptions of child labor that he got from Das Kapital. But where the Russian populist socialists appreciated Marx and Engels' analysis and critiques of capitalism, they were disgusted by Marx and Engels' attitudes towards the peasants. And they thought that the Marxist idea that you had to just sit on your ass and wait 100 years for capitalism to do its dirty work for you was both cruel and cowardly. So, for example, one Russian socialist, Pyotr Tkachev, who was a big influence on Lenin, he had a bitter debate with Engels about the possibility of socialism in Russia. And Tkachev was just horrified at what he considered to be Engels' heartless and cowardly insistence that Russia would just have to be stuck with all of the evils and horrors of capitalism for the next century or so. And to quote Tkachev, "This does not disturb them," them meaning the Marxists. "They will just wait. They do not lack patience. The people's grief, the people's tears, they are not their grief, their tears. Why should they compromise themselves in risky enterprises," meaning revolutionary activity. "They want to act only when it is a sure thing. But it is impossible to act now and to be certain. We, all the revolutionaries, understand this very well, and they, the Marxists, understand it better than we. But we are not afraid of the risk. Neither we nor the people have anything to regret, anything to lose." Unquote. And the populists also found the Russian Marxists to be much too friendly to the bourgeoisie and to capitalism. The bourgeoisie meaning the business-owning class. For example, Plekhanov, the father of Russian Marxism, was running around chastising the proletariat, the factory workers, for not being supportive enough of the bourgeoisie's social and legislative goals, because in his mind, advancing the goals of the business class was the only way to eventually achieve the workers' goals, as well as his own personal goals. It's like today when you have all these comfortable, self-satisfied, upper-middle-class dorks telling you that you can't have rent control and you need to let landlords evict your entire neighborhood because that will incentivize more housing to be built, which eventually will benefit all renters with lower rents in 200 years. Until then, you're evicted, you're working 60 hours a week just so that you can live under your mother's bed until you die. Now, Pyotr Struve, who started out as an important Marxist, he loved the bourgeoisie and the business class so much that he bought the company. And by that, I mean that he ended up founding Russia's main liberal business class party, the Constitutional Democrats, or Cadets for short, and they'll play a big role in the Russian Revolution, as we'll see next time. Later in his life, Struve pointed out that Russian Marxists of this period were actually playing the same role that the bourgeois liberal intellectuals had played in Western Europe in the early years of capitalism. And by that he meant that they were arguing for and providing intellectual justifications for the goals of the business class, like turning peasants into landless proletarians, and establishing a representative democracy that will be dominated by the business class. And Struve pointed out that, in general, the Marxists in Russia were much more interested in attacking the people who defended the peasants and their communes than they were in attacking the business class. Ironically, the Marxists were on the same side as the monarchy in this respect. In the early 1900s, peasant unrest was growing, and the monarchy introduced capitalist reforms specifically to destroy the peasant communes and to turn the communist peasants into petit bourgeois, mom-and-pop entrepreneur-type peasants that existed in Western Europe and the United States. The government hoped that this would make the peasants more conservative, and it would make them interested in defending private property and in siding with the government instead of wanting to expropriate all the private property. Many Marxists supported those government reforms because the faster the peasants could be ripped away from their communes and then turfed out into bankruptcy and into the urban slums, the more the proletarian factory worker base of the Marxists would grow and the faster their socialist future would come. Nikolai Zieber, the first big Russian Marxist economist, insisted that the Russian peasants needed to be, quote, cooked up in the industrial boiler, unquote, until they became proletarians, if Russia was going to have any future at all. And Vladimir Lenin, the future leader of the communist revolution, thought along those same lines when he was a young man. There was a serious famine in 1891 in the rural areas, and at that time Lenin was against the idea of humanitarian aid to the peasants. Why was the future leader of Third World Communist Revolution against helping peasants avoid starvation? Because the famine would force millions of peasants to escape into the cities and to become proletarians, which is just what you need for socialism, according to his hero Karl Marx. And if you help the peasants not starve to death, and if you help them remain on their communist communes, then you're just slowing down the forward march of progress towards communism. Again, ask yourself, why does this person want socialism? Does this person really have deep empathic feelings for the liberation of oppressed groups or humanity, or is it something else? And frankly, this is just a very human trait. We often view people in terms of how they can benefit us. And when it's divorced from actual connections with real human beings, and it becomes abstractions, this can reach really horrid proportions of psychopathy. And it's worse when you're young and you don't have as much experience with people, and also your empathy neurons haven't grown into your brain yet. So maybe we can forgive Lenin, but we'll see as we go. And speaking of little rich shits at the core of socialism in Russia and trust fund socialists in the US today, during that same 1891 peasant famine, when Lenin is advocating for letting peasants be destroyed by famine, Lenin sued his own peasant neighbors for causing damage to his family estate. Meanwhile, he'd be writing scathing articles against gentry capitalism, while all of his income was from rents and interest derived from the sale of his mother's estate. So at this time, late 19th century, you have the populist socialists sharply criticizing the Marxists for being cheerleaders of the business class, and cheerleaders of capitalism, and cheerleaders for the inhumane destruction of the peasants and their communist communes. In 1898, the Marxists decided to organize, and they form a political party called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which is what most socialist parties in most countries at the time were called, Social Democratic Party or Social Democratic Labor Party. And this all brings us back to one of our big questions that we asked at the beginning. If Karl Marx and the Marxists in general didn't believe that you could have socialism in a peasant country like Russia, then why on earth would you start a Marxist Social Democratic Labor Party in Russia to begin with? Well, the idea behind the Marxist Party in Russia was that as capitalism would progress, the party would help organize the growing number of proletarian factory workers who would be thrown out of the peasant life and into the cities and slums. The party would help organize them into unions and help them organize to overthrow the Tsar together with the business class. And keep in mind that socialist parties are illegal during most of this period, and there's no democratically elected parliament or anything, except for a couple of years after an attempted revolution in 1905, so all of these political parties are underground activist organizations for most of their existence until we get to the revolutions of 1917. They weren't the boring social climber, corruption engine political parties as we think of them today. They were more like the Black Panthers or like Hezbollah or something before they became an electoral party. They were organizing outside of the state, but with the goal to eventually take over the state, or at least to participate in it. And of course, since socialism was impossible in Russia, the Marxists expected that the first revolution, the one which should overthrow the Tsar and the aristocracy, would be a bourgeois business class capitalist revolution, which would result in a democratic capitalist republic, like what we have today in Europe. And the socialists could then be a legitimate legal political party with nice jobs in the legislature, representing the factory workers and advancing their rights and advocating for them to have the best possible conditions that laborers could have in capitalism: an 8-hour workday, the right to unionize, an end to child labor, rights for women, etc. And then, after 100 years or so, when the factory workers would be a large enough majority and capitalist industry had expanded enough, the party would lead the workers through another revolution, this time in order to usher in socialism. Unsurprisingly, given their ideology, the Marxists had very little support outside of the big urban areas. And the support that they did have was limited mostly to intellectuals, but also the small but growing number of proletarian factory workers. And even among those factory workers, they were mostly only popular with those workers who were more skilled and more literate than most, versus the majority of workers who had just come from the farm recently. And many of those workers were still members of their communes, going back to the farm every harvest season to help out the family in the commune. Now, at the same time as you had populism, which was the vast majority of the socialist movement, and Marxism, which was a small minority, you also had an anarchist movement in Russia. And like we went over last time, the anarchists were socialists who believed that you absolutely needed to abolish the state from the get-go for any kind of real socialism to happen. For the anarchists, the state is not a neutral tool that can be good or bad depending on who's running it. It's an institution which can only exist to prop up the ruling class, whether that class be the monarchy, the capitalists, or the socialist intellectuals. It can't be used by the people for the people, because once the people get into office, they don't become the people anymore. They become a ruling class with different material interests from the people who elected them. And the anarchists saw all political parties, whether the Marxists or the socialist revolutionaries, as mainly vehicles for middle-class and aristocratic intellectuals to advance their own interests in the name of the people, whether those people be the peasants in the case of the populist socialist revolutionaries, or whether it be the proletarians in the case of the Marxist social democrats. The peasants and the proletariat are the horses that will ride the socialist intellectuals onto their iron throne or ergonomic chair or whatever. And in this sense, the anarchists were more Marxist than Marx himself. And what I mean by that is that Marx was very keen to identify different classes of people as behaving according to their material interests. And the whole point of dividing people up into different class categories, because categories are just human inventions, the reason we invent class is to predict how people are likely to act. And in this case, how people act in terms of being allies or enemies on the road to socialism. Yet Marx had this huge blind spot when it came to the idea that intellectuals or state representatives might have different material interests from the people that they claim to represent. And last time I quoted Bakunin's famous predictions about this. And next time we'll see how this blind spot in Marxism expands to galactic proportions when we get to Marx's Russian followers in the period of and after the Russian Revolution. Now, where Marx and his followers felt like their socialism was unique in that it had science and the supposed laws of history behind it, and Engels obnoxiously called Marxism scientific socialism, the Russian anarchists, many of whom were followers of Pyotr Kropotkin, who was a biologist, they also felt like they had science and the trajectory of history and material conditions on their side. They just had a different assessment of how these material forces were going to play out than Marx did. Kropotkin noticed that social animals could only live by working together and helping each other, and that humans were more social than most. And to Kropotkin, the intensifying autocracy and absolutist monarchy of the past couple hundred years looked like a temporary aberration in human history. In the Middle Ages and in indigenous societies, just as among the Russian peasantry of his day, humans prospered by forming voluntary organizations and working together on a voluntary basis, and they tended more often than not to live communally. This was the natural state of humanity for Kropotkin, and it had been only temporarily usurped in recent century by absolutist monarchs. And the natural spirit of mutual aid and decentralized cooperation was beginning to reassert itself, in part via movements to overthrow autocracy and establish democracy, and then socialism. Unlike the Marxists, but like the populists, the anarchists believed that a peasant country was no obstacle to socialism. Peasants would be convinced to adopt socialism because it was in their own interest to do so. And given that Kropotkin's vision of socialism was based on small-scale production, and it didn't necessitate the giant advanced industry or the proletarianization of the peasants the way that Marxism did, the idea of a peasant socialist society was not an unreasonable expectation. But what's really interesting about the anarchists is just how not popular they were in Russia. Aside for a couple of years around the 1905 attempted revolution, anarchism was almost non-existent in Russia until the revolutions of 1917. They had zero adherents among the peasants, and barely had any adherents in the intellectual circles either. Like, you'll read histories of anarchism, and the author is like, anarchist societies flourished in the lead-up to 1917. They had 100 members in Petrograd, and 70 in Moscow. These are cities with 1 million people in a country of 100 million people. And their unpopularity is really remarkable for two big reasons. For one, arguably the top two most important anarchist thinkers ever, Bakunin and Kropotkin, were Russian, and from this time period. Bakunin and Kropotkin's ideas became popular and inspired long-lasting social movements and huge organizations of anarchist peasants and factory workers in southern Italy and France, and especially in Spain. But in Russia, crickets. On the one hand, maybe it's not so surprising that anarchism wasn't so popular, because in Russia, as we saw, socialism was mostly popular among intellectuals, and the intellectual class doesn't really play any special role in anarchism. They need to get a job and participate in the economy like everyone else. There's no horsey to ride to power on. But it is really remarkable that anarchism made no inroads in the giant peasant population of Russia. And the reason that this is so remarkable is because anarchism is in many ways the perfect ideology for peasants in general, and for Russian peasants in particular. In peasants worldwide, you see aspirations that resemble anarchism throughout history. The English Peasants' Revolt in 1381 that I've talked about before aspired to a stateless Christian commonwealth. The Zapata Rebellion in Mexico in the early 20th century, and then again in the 1990s, had similar aims. And anarchism was popular among peasants in Italy and Spain. And in Spain in the 1930s, like I'm always talking about, the peasants and urban anarchists together managed to make a revolution for 2 years or so. But Russia in particular had a history of all sorts of peasant religious sects and peasant uprisings which had aims similar to anarchism over the centuries. For example, the Doukhobor sect, which are sort of like Russian Amish people. One Doukhobor, speaking from prison in 1791, told his captors, quote, "The children of God have no need either of czars or ruling powers or of any human laws whatsoever." Unquote. Peasants tended to conceive of land as something that could only belong to God, or to nobody, or to the state, and they tended to imagine the state as a giant commune of communes, similar to the ideas for anarchist federations. In the lead-up to the almost revolution of 1905, a peasant representative of the National Peasants' Union, which the peasants had formed, declared that, quote, "Land is the mother of us all. It is not the product of human hands, but of the Holy Spirit. Therefore it must not be bought and sold." Unquote. And a majority of the assembled delegates at that time supported the complete abolition of private land ownership and the redistribution of existing lands to the population as a whole based on family size. And the great 19th century Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy was famously a sort of Christian anarchist, and his ideas did have many adherents in Russia and around the world, though it wasn't a revolutionary political type of anarchism that planned to overthrow the government and give power to the peasants. It was a pacifist spiritual movement that was much less of a threat to authority, even though the Tolstoyan anarchists rejected both the state and the Orthodox Church. According to Paul Avrich, one of the leading historians of anarchism, quote, "Leo Tolstoy and his followers began to form anarchistic groups during the 1880s in Tula, Orel, and Samara provinces, and in the city of Moscow. By the turn of the century, Tolstoyan missionaries had spread the gospel of Christian anarchism with considerable effect throughout the Black Earth provinces." Unquote. And this is the exact same revolutionary period that we're talking about with the populist socialists and the Marxists. Yet, despite all of this, Avrich continues, quote, "Notwithstanding this rich legacy left by the peasant revolts, the religious sects and the Tolstoyan groups, the Petroshevtsi and the Slavophiles and Alexander Herzen, no revolutionary anarchist movement arose in Russia before the 20th century, not even in the heyday of Bakunin during the late 1860s and early 1870s. Unquote. And we see that when anarchism does come to the Russian Empire, its most powerful impact is among peasants from the south of Ukraine, and some of the urban workers and sailors in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but not among the giant majority of Central Russian peasants who believe in all of these anarchist ideas. And that is an incredible failure of the anarchist movement. Now, to understand why anarchism is such a natural fit for peasants around the world, and to understand why socialist anarchism never got anywhere in Russia, we need to understand a bit about who peasants are in general, and who the Russian peasants were in particular at this time. And then we also need to understand who the Russian anarchists were in contrast. First of all, what is peasant? A peasant is a lot like an indigenous subsistence farmer, and peasants and indigenous subsistence farmers have a lot in common. They're small communities of people who live from their agricultural labor. But there are two main things that separate them. First of all, what makes a peasant and not an indigenous subsistence farmer has nothing to do with the color of their skin or their ethnicity. The difference is that the peasant community has been conquered by a more powerful force, and then they get exploited by that force. Where the indigenous farmer works to provide food for their family and their community and their cultural and religious activities, and often for trade, the peasant has to do all of those things, but also has to give a significant portion of their produce to the conquering power. And these conquering powers usually organize themselves into states, precisely in order to effectively maintain their relations of exploitation and domination over the peasants. That's the whole point for why a lot of early states formed in the first place. The classic example of an early state is when a group of nomadic pastoralist raiders would conquer local farmers. Pastoralists are nomadic people who live from their animal herds, like Mongolians with their horses, or the Nuer with their cattle, or the Bedouin with their camels. And pastoralists are usually great warriors, because they have to constantly defend their herds from other pastoralists who are trying to steal their animals. And they're constantly trying to steal animals from their neighbors also to increase their own herds. And they're good at conquering peasants because the peasants are just stuck on their plots of land, while the pastoralists are nomadic and free to go anywhere with grasses to graze. So pastoralists often have this warrior ethic, And peasants often have this peaceful humility ethic because they just can't really be effective fighters. And they hate violence because violence is usually just them getting their asses whipped. Whereas pastoralists love violence because it's usually them whipping other people's asses. Now, when pastoralists unite together into large groups, and they often do so under a great religious leader who can unite the fractious warring tribes, like think of Muhammad or King David or Genghis Khan, well, then the pastoralists become a fearsome conquering army. And they often figure out that instead of living a precarious life doing pastoralism plus agriculture, it's a lot easier for them to just conquer a bunch of sedentary farmers who are stuck in one place all year and then just live from the peasants' labor. So once they unite, they can end up conquering vast territories of helpless subsistence farmers very easily. Think of the Mongol Empire or the Great Arab Expansion over huge continents. And if the conquest is of large enough scale, then the pastoralists will end up forming a state to manage the exploitation of the peasants. And then their descendants end up being lazy, corrupt, fancy lads and lassies who live entirely from the exploitation, who've never done a day of work or fighting in their life. This is why Marx and many socialists in the 19th and early 20th centuries thought that the state existed exclusively for the exploitation of one class by another, because that's exactly why most states came to existence in the first place. And as a result, most peasants around the world have historically hated the state. Before the era of mass democracy and social programs, all the state did was take a giant chunk of their labor to enrich the ruling class, while supplying nothing in return. The state judged them in courts run by and for the ruling classes, and subjected them to the police who enforced the rules that exploited them for the ruling class. And once the ruling class would become too rich and too lazy to do any actual fighting, the state would start to conscript the peasants' sons into the army, and force them to fight and die for faraway causes and wars that only benefited their rulers. And peasants tend not to have any interest in wars because there's barely often any difference in being conquered by one state versus another state. One year you're subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the next year the Germans, the next year the Russian Tsar, and not very much changes. Things could even be better under a monarch of a different ethnicity if the ruler is just less of a maniac. And before the era of mass literacy and mass media, peasants had no sense of nationalism or national identity. National identity and nationalism, the idea of your identity being connected to people that you've never met and territories that you'll never visit, these are very much products of the imagination. And nationalism is made possible by literacy and mass media to put those imaginary ideas in your head. In the 19th century, that was newspapers and novels. And that's why nationalism started out as an urban phenomenon, promoted by ruling classes who aspire to control and unite larger territories under their rule. Today we're plugged into mass media all day long, which expands our social horizons in real and fictional ways, and we get our identities from media and live half of our lives as part of real and imagined communities. But the world of the historic pre-democracy peasant was limited to the real world, plus their religions and gossip, and their real world tended to be very small. They'd be stuck on a plot of land and spend most of their lives in the same village, aside from some festivals and some markets, without much information going back and forth between them and the outside world, aside from gossip and some conversations that they might have at those special festivals and special occasions. As a result, their collective identity was often just identifying with their own village or their own commune, in opposition to other villages and other communes. They had like village nationalism. So the peasants had a very local collective identity, and the only time they would meet outsiders besides at festivals and markets was people like landlords and tax collectors, or if they got conscripted into a war, or if they were forced to work part of the year in an urban factory. And that brings us to the other great division between peasants and indigenous agriculturalists, and that is religion. Indigenous subsistence farmers usually have their own belief system and religion, which is adapted to their social and environmental worlds and their local indigenous social hierarchies or lack of hierarchies, but peasants are usually subject to the religion of the ruling class, which is a broader ruling class. Like indigenous farmers might be subjected to the ideas of their ruling class, but their ruling class is part of their community. In the peasant world, the ruling class is part of the outsider state. Via religion, the peasants are culturally integrated into the broader hierarchy of the exploitation state. But peasants don't just accept the religion that's handed to them by the elite clergy and the ruling class. Religion and ideology have to make sense and fit within the material and practical conditions of people's lives in order for them to take it seriously long term. So, peasant versions of religions will often be a really interesting mix of the official state religion, transformed by their own previous indigenous customs and their own value system. It's called syncretism in anthropology. And the word pagan, or paganus in Latin, means a person from the country. In the first centuries of the Christian expansion, the true Christian religion was thought to exist in the cities and in the monasteries, and the peasants were seen as impure corruptors of the religion. Religion in states was always a tool of empire, but by empire it was the rule of the state over the peasant. And among peasants where there are no traces of the indigenous religion left, like in 19th century Russia, you'll have very distinct peasant versions of the religion, which makes it fit in with their peasant values, which are derived from their everyday lives and their economic life. So like when we looked at the English peasants of 1381, we saw that although the peasants were devout Christians, their version of Christian values were in total opposition to the state's version. The state religion placed the king above the nobility, who were above the peasants, and that was seen as the natural order of the world. But the peasants at that time understood the Bible in a way that rejected the nobility and saw them as parasites and as ungodly people who don't do any work. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman, was the common refrain. Meaning when Adam plowed the fields and Eve spun yarns, there were no social classes, no nobility. Everyone worked for a living to support themselves as equals. But while the English peasants rejected the nobility, whom they knew from experience to be parasites, they still revered the king, who they didn't have any actual contact with, and who was just this figure of imagination that they could fill up with any of their ideals that they wanted to. And so they saw him as legitimately appointed by God and as a sort of religious leader. And we saw how that belief ended up destroying the peasants' revolt in the end. So, what are the conditions and beliefs and ideals of the peasants in Russia in the late 1880s and early 1900s, which is when the different types of socialism are picking up steam and gaining traction among the urban and rural intelligentsia? In terms of beliefs, most of the peasants of Russia had that sort of natural Christian quasi-anarchism that we saw with the peasants of 1381. They believed that landlords and moneylenders and police and bureaucrats and aristocrats and private land ownership should not exist. And their ideal world was one where everyone makes an honest living by working the land in their communes, which are divided up equally so that everyone gets an equal piece of land, which was also pretty much the vision of the far left in the French Revolution of 1789, incidentally. And you'd also have craftspeople trading in markets for things that they need and that they couldn't produce locally. And they believed that decision-making should be communal and democratic, though it would also be patriarchal. And their idea for Russia as a whole is that it would be one giant commune of communes, and the federal government would be like one big direct democratic peasant assembly. The only major ways that peasant ideology differed from the general ideas of anarchist socialism was the patriarchy, and that the peasants were deeply religious, and they thought that the Tsar was their little father, appointed by God to be a sort of non-authoritarian symbolic embodiment of all their values. And patriarchy and monarchy sound incompatible with anarchism, and they are, but we'll see later that when the Tsar and church don't act according to the peasants' values, the peasants were very quick to ditch both of them. And surprisingly, we'll see later that when the peasants started forming revolutionary assemblies, they often insisted on women's right to vote and other women's rights. In terms of social structure, like I mentioned earlier, the peasants lived on communes, which had communal property, but also private property for specific families, though care was taken to make sure that each plot was always equal, and the lines were always redrawn to make sure that never changed. To quote from the sociologist of peasants, Theodor Shanin, from his book Late Marx, quote, "Each household held unconditionally only a small plot of land, i.e. house and garden plus its livestock and equipment. The use of arable land was assigned to a family on a long-term basis by its commune. The meadows were reassigned annually and often worked collectively. The pastures and forests were in common use. Many vital services were run collectively by the commune, a village shepherd, the local guards, the welfare of the orphans, and often a school, a church, a mill, etc. An assembly of heads of the households controlled and represented communal interests, decided about the services, elected its own officers, and collected its informal taxes or dues. The assembly also periodically redivided the arable lands in accordance with some egalitarian principle, usually in relation to the changing size of the families involved." Unquote. There was some economic inequality on the communes, And the Marxists tried to make a lot of this in order to argue that peasants were little capitalists at heart and that the commune wasn't really communist. But this inequality was almost entirely a factor of which part of their life cycle a peasant's family was in. When an adult son got married and had children, the commune would give him a small plot of land, and they would be poor relative to the rest of the commune. But as the kids grew up and contributed to the economy, they gained more land and more wealth, and they'd be rich relative to the commune, until it was time to divide their land again, and the kids got married. And if you had more kids doing more productive labor, you'd be more rich. But then you'd end up being poor later, as there would be more divisions of land. So, from generation to generation, the poorest families became the richest ones, and vice versa. Even though peasants participated in and were in favor of the market economy, there was no way for great wealth inequality to build because of the mechanics of the commune system. It kept redistributing the wealth, and thereby eliminating the worst aspects of the market economy and keeping all of its benefits. There were some families who employed wage labor, but it wasn't the richest families, which is what the Marxists thought. It was people whose kids had gone to war, or working-age kids had become sick, or died, or had to leave the village to look for work, so they needed help to do basic work in order to survive. And usually wage labor was temporary labor. The only people who employed wage labor for profit were aristocratic landowners or entrepreneurs. Economic inequality existed between communes, and that was mostly a result of geography. And aside from peasants who were closer to the urban centers, most of Russia's peasants were extremely poor, and their conditions were getting worse and worse. Russia was a huge empire with different geographies and therefore different conditions in different places. But for the vast majority of the ethnically Russian peasants of this period, there was an extreme and increasingly worse land shortage and overpopulation crisis. I didn't see this indicated in any of the stuff that I've been reading, but I would imagine that this crisis was in part related to medical advancements of the 19th century, which were reducing infant mortality and changing demographics across Europe at the time. Whatever the reason, you just had too many peasants and not enough land, and specifically not enough land to support people according to the extremely primitive agricultural techniques that the peasants were still using at the time, and they were way behind other parts of the world. Ironically, this land shortage was made worse by the end of serfdom, which happened in Russia by royal decree in 1861. And it's always the case when you get liberation from above rather than from below, that freedom from serfdom was almost as bad as serfdom itself, or maybe even worse, as the emancipated peasants were forced to compensate their poor boo-boo landlords for the loss of their lands, even though the landlords had been basically stealing from the peasants for centuries. And those compensation payments were either huge, massive amounts of cash, often double what the land was actually worth on the market, and this often left the tenant in debt to the landlord for life, or else the payment would be made in the form of giving the landlord a big chunk of the land which you had formerly used to feed yourself. And what the peasant had left over for himself wasn't enough to survive on, so of course they had to borrow from moneylenders in order to survive. And their former landlords, who had plenty of cash sloshing around, were happy to start new careers as moneylenders. So you still had almost the same exact dependence and exploitation relationship after emancipation as you had before. As a result of this new debt serfdom, each administrative region had a small number of moneylenders and merchants who took advantage of the peasants' desperation to exploit them even further. Merchants would buy the peasants' grain cheap in the fall when the peasants needed to pay their taxes and debt obligations. And then they would sell back to the peasants the exact same grain for double the price in spring when the peasants ran out of grain that they needed to feed themselves with. And the peasants called this class of vampire squid moneylenders and merchants the kulaks, meaning closed fists, ruthless money grubbers. And as the overpopulation crisis increased, the moneylenders and merchants became more and more ruthless, causing more and more peasants to have to give up their land as payment and then go off to look for work as hired help for peasant families or landlord families, or more often to the cities and the factories. And once you lost your connection to your commune, you couldn't just go establish yourself somewhere else. Basically, you lost your entire social network and your financial support, and you were completely adrift and subject to the whims of the labor market. And as a result of all this, the peasants were increasingly ready to revolt. And their number one desire was to take their land back from the parasite aristocratic landlords, and also from the church, and to redistribute it equally amongst themselves. So in terms of their social structure, their desperate material conditions, and their belief system, the peasants were just perfect material for some kind of revolutionary socialism, and especially some kind of libertarian, anti-authoritarian, anti-state socialism, aka Anarchism. Now, in 1905, you have what's called the Revolution of 1905, which wasn't really a revolution because the monarchy remained firmly in place by the end of it, but for a couple of years, the monarchy allowed a democratically elected parliament to operate. And during that sort of revolution, peasant unrest played the main role. And the peasants started self-organizing and connected with the urban and rural socialist intellectuals, which very much scared the shit out of the rural aristocracy and also the monarchy. And the lesson that the ruling classes learned was that the peasant commune was a dangerous locus of rebellion, which needed to be eliminated. And so the prime minister at the time, Stolypin, introduced a bunch of reforms, which we call the Stolypin reforms. And these were aimed at doing just that, destroying the peasant commune. And the idea was to incentivize the peasants to break up their communes into independent family farms, like in Western Europe. And then the market forces would turn the communist peasants into petit bourgeois, mom-and-pop small entrepreneurs who would be concerned with increasing their wealth and protecting their private property instead of with having solidarity with their neighbors and trying to form peasant brigades and armies to take land away from the landlords by armed rebellion. And the Stolypin reforms were mostly a big failure on that front. Very few peasants decided to break up their communes, aside from a small number of families in the more prosperous areas closer to the cities. But although these reforms were a failure, the government did what governments often do, especially non-democratic governments who control the media. They lied. And the press would regularly report about how these wonderful modernizing reforms were turning stupid, backwards communist peasants into smart, savvy, industrious little capitalist entrepreneurs. And this had a really terrible effect on these socialist intellectuals that we'll see, because the intellectuals tended to believe this propaganda. So back to the anarchists. How is it that anarchism never took off among the peasants, despite how well suited anarchism was to peasant ideology and peasant discontent and peasant social structure? The number one reason is that anarchists, like all the other socialists, were generally urban people or rural intelligentsia from the administrative towns, and the anarchists just never put in any serious effort to actually go out and connect to the peasants. There was no going to the people anarchist movement, at least not a socialist anarchist movement. There was the Christian Tolstoyists. In Spain, where you had anarchist missionaries going from village to village preaching their ideas, you ended up with a huge anarchist movement, and even an anarchist revolution in the 1930s. But in Russia, the closest you got to the peasants was some rural intelligentsia circle jerks on Kropotkin's estate. Maybe there just wasn't enough urban anarchists to form a proper going-to-the-people movement. But maybe an even more important reason why the anarchists weren't very popular was because the majority of the anarchists during this period belonged to insane terrorist organizations who just ran around blowing up cafes and killing as many people as possible. I think killing random people is always morally wrong, but sometimes terrorism can achieve some political goals. But in this case, none of it accomplished anything except for attracting more and more psychos to the movement and increasing government repression and helping the media around the world associate free socialism and anarchism with mindless murders and terrorism. Many anarchists were against terrorism, but they were a bit less than half of the anarchists in Russia at the time, and the terrorist ones, of course, got 100 times more attention. The anarchists are not really important on the Russian scene until we get to the Russian Revolution itself. So let's get back to the Marxists, who are the ones who lead the revolution and who do take power. As we've seen, the Marxists at this point are so busy having their heads up their asses and mindlessly following Marx's writing like a bunch of brain-dead cult losers that they are completely oblivious to the socialist potential of this giant mass of angry, desperate peasant communists staring them straight in the face. And while the peasants are just waiting to revolt and just waiting to be connected to an urban movement to help them achieve their goals, the Marxists are cheering on the advance of capitalism and the destruction of the peasant commune, and they're attacking anyone who wants to protect the commune. As inherently ridiculous and shameful as this was, what's even more ridiculous and shameful about it is that the Marxists kept believing in this stuff even though Karl Marx himself had changed his opinion on the peasants at this point. And he had come to adopt a point of view that was very similar to that of the Russian populist socialists. Marx 2.0. Around 1870, the time of the Paris Commune, Marx became acquainted with the work of Nikolai Danielson, a Russian socialist who had translated Das Kapital into Russian. and Danielson had been compiling the latest statistics and quantitative data about the Russian peasants that had previously not been available. Marx was so interested in this, and in the idea that these communes could be a potential alternative path to socialism, that he learned how to read and write Russian just so that he could read the relevant literature on the subject firsthand. He became pen pals with Danielson and corresponded with him extensively for the rest of his life. Marx accumulated a library of over 200 Russian-language books, and Marx theorized extensively about the commune and its implications for an alternative path to socialism in Russia, and he wrote about it in his voluminous notes. In the first edition of Capital Volume 1, which was published in 1867, Marx shits on people for defending the Russian peasant commune. But in the 1873 second edition, he deleted those parts where he's shitting on those people, and instead he flips it around and starts critiquing the class interest and motivations of those socialists who critiqued the Russian commune. Theodor Shanin, the sociologist of peasantry, writes about Marx's shift on the issue of peasants in his book Late Marx. Quote, Marx came to see the decline of the peasant commune in Western Europe, because peasants in Western Europe had been living in similar types of communes before the industrial era. So he came to see the decline of the peasant commune in Western Europe, quote, not as a law of social sciences, not as a spontaneous economic process, but as the result of an assault on the majority of the people which could and should be fought. The main limitation of the rural commune, i.e. their isolation, could be overcome by the popular insurrection and the consequent supplementing of the state by assemblies elected by the communes, and economic and administrative bodies serving their own interests. That is, peasants running their own affairs within and as a part of the socialist society. Moreover, that may make some chiefly peasant countries, quoting Marx, supreme in that sense to the societies where capitalism rules. That is indeed why the Western precedent would prove here nothing at all. Unquote. In other words, Marx not only thought that peasant socialism was possible, but he thought that it might be a better bet than socialism in advanced industrial countries. In 1872, Marx told Danielson that he planned to devote a whole section of Capital Volume 3 to the topic of Russian property. But unfortunately, Marx never ended up publishing anything on the issue besides a short preface to the 1882 edition of the Communist Manifesto. And that passage itself is rather reserved. Quote, now the question is, can the Russian commune, a form of primeval common ownership of land, pass directly to the higher form of communist common ownership? Or must it first pass through the same process of dissolution, such as constitutes the historical evolution of the West? The only answer to that possible today is this. If the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, the present Russian common ownership of land may serve as the starting point for a communist development. Unquote. In other words, if events in Russia, like the overthrow of the monarchy, inspire revolution in the West, then the communist West can help Russia build socialism on a peasant economy. It's hard to know why Marx never wrote anything on the subject, despite devoting so much time and energy learning and thinking about it. But although he wrote 30,000 pages of notes from 1871 until his death in 1883, he barely published anything at all on any subject, aside from various letters. The reasons for his relative silence in the last phase of his life are subject to some debate, and there are some interesting theories on this for another time. But when it comes to the potential for peasant socialism, I get the sense from reading some of his correspondence on the subject, and from the manifesto preface that I just read, that Marx was afraid to be too bold, and that he kept toning down his more enthusiastic thoughts. He was shifting a lot of opinions on a lot of things in this era, and quietly backtracking on some of the brash, self-confident positions that he'd been taking for much of his life. So maybe he lost a little of his nerve, and was a little afraid to contradict himself too obviously. For example, in 1881, Marx had corresponded with a young Russian Marxist and disciple of Plekhanov named Vera Zasulich. Zasulich asks Marx if there's any hope of socialism in Russia without having to go through an extended capitalist phase. Quote, the personal destiny of our revolutionary socialists depends on what you have to say on this question. Either this rural commune is capable of developing along the socialist path. In this case, the revolutionary socialist must sacrifice all his strength to the liberation of the commune and to its development. If, on the contrary, the commune is doomed to perish, and here she's talking about the Russian Marxist point of view, There remains nothing for the socialist as such to do, but devote himself to more or less arbitrary calculations in order to learn in how many decades the land of the Russian peasant will pass out of his hands and into those of the bourgeoisie. In how many centuries, perhaps, capitalism will reach in Russia the development it has attained in Western Europe. They will then have to conduct propaganda only among the workers of the towns, who will be continually swamped in the mass of peasants, who, as a result of the dissolution of the commune, will be thrown onto the streets of the big cities in search of hire. In recent times, we often hear it said that the rural commune is an archaic form, which history, scientific socialism, in a word, everything that is beyond dispute, has condemned to doom. The people who preach this call themselves your preeminent disciples, Marxists. Their strongest argument is often, Marx says so, unquote. And Marx's reply is really interesting, because he writes 4 drafts, and you can see his hesitance to assert anything too forcefully by the progression of the drafts. He starts with a long, several pages response, and then ends up with a short response about a page long. And I'll link to all the versions in the bibliography. In one of the drafts he says, quote, "In Russia, thanks to a singular combination of circumstances, the rural commune can gradually extricate itself from its primitive characteristics and develop directly as an element of collective production on a national scale. The common ownership of the land permits it to transform piecemeal and individualistic agriculture directly and gradually into collective agriculture, and the Russian peasants already practice it. The physical configuration of Russia's soil invites mechanized exploitation on a vast scale. The familiarity of the peasant with the artel contract facilitates for him the transition from piecemeal to cooperative work. And finally, Russian society, which has so long lived at his expense, owes him the advances necessary for such a transition." Unquote. And an artel contract was a cooperative organization that you established to form some kind of collective activity like mining, or a rural-urban trade cooperative. And Marx continues, quote, "On the other hand, the contemporary existence of Western production, which dominates the world market, permits Russia to incorporate in the commune all the positive acquisitions elaborated by the capitalist system without passing through its Caudine forks." And that's a reference to a famous Roman battle where the Romans had to surrender without even fighting because they were just trapped. The idea is that the market forces of capitalism conquers people without having to use weapons. Marx continues, quote, "If the revolution takes place at an opportune time, if it concentrates all its force to assure the free upswing of the rural commune, the commune will soon develop as a regenerating element of Russian society, and as an element of superiority over the countries enthralled by the capitalist regime." Unquote. So basically he's saying that there's more of a chance of socialism in Russia and in peasant countries that have a communistic tradition versus in the rich capitalist countries. So he's completely reversing his earlier position. But weirdly, he leaves out most of this, the stuff that I just quoted, in his final response. And in that response, he tells Vera Zasulich that, quote, "The special study that I've made of it, including a search for original source material, has convinced me that the commune is the fulcrum for social regeneration in Russia. But in order that it might function as such, the harmful influences assailing it on all sides must first be eliminated, and it must then be assured the normal conditions for spontaneous development." Unquote. Note that even his totally toned-down response is still the exact opposite of what the so-called Marxists, like Plekhanov, had been arguing. The Russian Marxists were saying that the Russians had to sit on their asses for 100 years before they can even think of socialism. And it was during this period, and in reaction to the mindless followship of the Plekhanov types, that Marx famously quipped, "I am not a Marxist." According to Esther Kingston Mann, Marx advised his Russian admirers to carry out their own economic investigations of the Russian scene instead of relying on Capital, his book, or on the lessons of England's experience. Marx's own investigations of the Russian data led him to question whether peasantries were inevitably doomed, or whether peasant and non-peasant societies might in fact coexist, like consecutive geological strata in the Earth's surface. Like many of Russia's leading professional economists and statisticians, Marx had become an agnostic rather than a true believer in the unique historical mission of the bourgeoisie in the modern world. Unquote. And elsewhere, Marx points out that, quote, "The English system is completely incapable of fulfilling the conditions on which the development of Russia's agriculture depends." Unquote. So, Marx is basically telling his Russian followers that the European road to socialism is not compatible with Russia's material conditions, and that he sees a lot of potential for socialism in Russia to be based on the peasant commune, but that his followers should make efforts to find out what they can learn for themselves about all of this so that they can develop their own appropriate strategies based on the realities of the situation and not on Marx's books, which are about Europe 100 years before. And in general, the idea that you should go learn about a situation before you take major earth-shattering action is probably the best advice that you can give. But instead of doing that, instead of following Marx's own instructions, Marx's Russian followers just ignored him. The peasant-hating Plekhanov made sure that none of Marx's correspondence on the subject was published in Russia. In Theodor Shenin's words, quote, "Already in Marx's own generation, there were Marxists who knew better than Marx what Marxism is, and were prepared to censor him on the sly for his own sake." Unquote. Now, as a result of all of his ideas on Russian peasant socialism being censored by his supposed followers in Russia, the young generation of up-and-coming Marxists, including Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky and Stalin and the rest of the future leaders of the Russian Revolution that we'll talk a lot about next time, none of them ever learn about Marx's change of opinion on peasant socialism. And they never take the time to investigate the issue in depth. And even though Lenin and Trotsky are more flexible and creative thinkers than Plekhanov and the rest of the Marxists, they continued to base all of their theories and strategies on outdated and factually incorrect ideas about the Russian peasantry, which they got from earlier Marxist texts, and from the fake news spread by the Russian government. And the consequences of this are going to be a spectacular, earth-shaking disaster, as we'll see next time. Speaking of which, give me money. This episode took 2 months just to do the research, though that includes research for the next episode or episodes. And during all that time, I'm putting these episodes together. I'm either working at the same time, but like just enough to survive, or I'm just not working at all and also not making any money, and then I have to make it up afterwards, and it just takes a giant hit to my income. I'm a lawyer for tenants, and my annual income is almost exactly what a full-time minimum wage worker makes in Canada. And I became a lawyer exactly so that I could work part-time and could afford to support working on projects like this. But fuck, it is a lot of work. And I don't monetize my channel, even though I'm eligible for it, because I don't want to gunk up your life with more stupid advertisements than you're already subjected to. And I don't do paywalled content, because that defeats the whole purpose of doing a show geared at spreading knowledge and skills. And some VPN company started asking me to sponsor them, and I will not be doing anything like that, because that's ridiculous, given what this show is. So your subscriptions are not purchasing a commodity, they are solidarity donations, because you're someone who can afford it, and you want the show to keep going, and you want me to keep going. There are options in the show notes to do per episode donations, or one-time donations, or monthly donations, if you don't mind the fact that sometimes it takes me 3 months to put out an episode. And honestly, before I blast away 3 more months of my life and pissing off all of my family and friends by ignoring them for all that time, and then almost totally going bankrupt, I think I'm going to do a couple of easier, lower effort, but also more fun episodes so that I can get a little more money and grow my audience before diving back into this like deep research insanity, because I just cannot sustain this level of intensity of work for so many months at a time while also having a job, while remaining moderately sane for basically no money. I make about $1,200 US per episode. Patreon takes like 200 of that. And this episode took 4 months to do. If you want to do a deep dive into the stuff I talked about today, and I recommend you do because it's really, really interesting, and it probably contradicts a lot of what you've heard before, so don't take my word for it, there's a link to the bibliography for this episode in the show notes and the video notes. And please like and subscribe, and also review the show on Apple Music. Those ratings and reviews are really important for the evil algorithm, which makes the show pop up more readily on searches. And contact me with any corrections or suggestions or comments at worldwidescroats@gmail.com, or comment on the YouTubes. And until next time, see ya!